Guessing you're recording. Yep, looks like everybody's gone. All right. All right, here we go. We're going to start a paragraph back, a couple paragraphs back from 324. We're going to go to African enthusiasm in seeking more a higher education was not confined to any part of the continent, although in some parts it was manifested at an earlier date and more intensely. For instance, the Gold Coast in Sierra Leone had a tradition of European education going back to the 17th century. Therefore, it was not at all surprising that the 1824, the Time Educational Supplement, commented that there was a universal demand for better and more education on the Gold Coast. It was the Gold Coast which produced J.E.K. Agri, that distinguished African educator and nationalist, and he fired the imagination of Africans well beyond the Gold Coast insofar as formal education was concerned. There was a definite correlation between the degree of colonial exploitation and the amount of social service provided. That applied to education in particular, So the urban, mining, and cash crop areas had a virtual monopoly of schools. That was partly due to the capitalist policy of enhancing the labor power of workers. But it was also the consequences of efforts made by Africans inside the cash economy. They made demands on the colonial administration, and they also went through a great deal of sacrifice and self-denial to get more school places. Thus, one finds that Igbos, who were earning income from palm oil, deployed a significant proportion of their small earnings into building schools, usually in associations with the church. Incidentally, it should be noted that what were called church or mission schools were often entirely financed by Africans. They paid church dues and they made donations for the church harvest, and they sometimes contributed to the special education fund, and they often paid school fees. The pattern was widespread in Igbo land, and it was not uncommon in other parts of colonial Africa. The existence of schools should be traced through the church back to palm oil and the people's labor. Indeed, it must not be forgotten that missionaries, administrators, white settlers, and whole lot were living off African labor and resources. In the cash crop areas of British Africa, it also became the practice to try to use the agricultural produce boards and similar institutions to finance education. After all, the agricultural boards were supposed to have been established in the interest of peasant producers. They concentrated on exporting surplus in the form of dollar reserves for Britain. But towards the end of colonial rule in the self-government epoch, it was too much of a scandal to avoid giving Africans some small part of the benefits of their labor. And so the produce boards were prevailed upon to make some funds available for education. For example, in 1953, the Ugandan Legislative Council voted to spend about 11 million pounds for cotton price stabilization fund of welfare schemes, with agricultural education receiving a big slice. Among those Africans who did somewhat better than their brothers financially, some philanthropy was expressed in terms of helping African children go to school. The historical records of African education under colonial rule reveal certain tidbits, such as the fact that the first secondary school was established in Somalia in 1949, not by the colonial administration or on the initiative of the church, but by Somali trader. Of course, it is still expected in Africa that anyone who is already educated and is earning a salary should in turn help to educate at least one or more member of his extended family. That is precisely because his extended family and his village community often made sacrifices to allow him to be educated in the first place. That was as true as Mauritanian as it was in the reserves of South Africa. And no African would have any difficulty in supplying his own examples to that effect. There are now available a number of biographies of Africans who gained prominence in colonial period, usually in the movement for the regaining of African independence. It invariably emerges from reading such biographies how much of the struggle it was to educate in colonial times. Same conclusion can be reached through reading the modern African novels, because the novelist, while writing what is called fiction, is concerned with capturing reality. Apologists for colonialism talk was though capturing reality. Apologists for colonialism talk was though education were a big meal handed down to Africans on a platter. It was not. The educational crumbs dropped were some small that individuals scrambled for them. They saved incredibly for small earnings and sent their children to school. The African children walked miles to and from school and thought nothing of it. But apart from physical and financial sacrifices, Africans in some colonies had to wage a political battle to have the principle of African education accepted. The colonies in question were those with white settler population. In Kenya, white settlers made it clear that it was that as far as they were concerned, an uneducated African was better than an educated one, and that one with the rudiments of education was at least preferable to one with more than a few years of schooling. The Beecher Report on Education in Kenya, produced in 1949, was heavily influenced by white settlers, and it stated frankly, and here's the statement: illiterates with the right attitude in manual employment are preferable to products of the schools who are not readily disposed to enter manual employment. Because of white settlers were close to the center of political power in the colonial system, they were able to apply their principles to education in Kenya. Very little education went to Africans. In effect, that meant the exception of the rule that more social facilities followed heightened exploitation. But the Kukui, who were the most exploited in Kenya, did not accept the situation passively. On line of approach was to bombard the colonial government with demands, even though Africans were in a far less favorable position to do so than white settlers. The demands were partially successful. The Beecher Report grudgingly conceded to few schools to Africans at the primary and secondary level by suggesting places for 40% of African children at junior primary, 10% at senior primary or intermediate, and 1% at secondary level. But by 1960, the number of primary schools were double what the whites thought should have been achieved by that date, and the number of secondary institutions was 3 times what the white settlers had succeeded in recommending. Besides, Besides, where the government was reluctant to build schools, it was subsidized. Or to subsidize missionaries to do so with the African taxes. There was an even greater incentive to handle educational matters directly. In Kenya, there was a SPAT, or what came to be called an independent school, comparable to independent churches, and in fact, springing from independent churches from the most part. The independent schools in Kenya formed two major associations, namely the Kakui Independent Schools Associations and the Kakui Karenga Education Association, formed in 1929. In practice, just as the European Christian missions used schools to attract converts to independent churches, attached. Hold on a second. Sorry, everybody. Attached great importance to schooling. John Chilembui made striking efforts in that respects, aided by brothers recruiting from another African descendants in the United States. The Muslim religion was also a stimulator for educational advance during the colonial period. In North Africa, Muslims often found it necessary to channel their efforts into schools other than those built by the colonialists. The Society of Reformist Ulema in Algeria started a large primary school program in 1936. By 1955, its primary school charter catered to 45,000 Algerian children. And from 1947, the society also ran a large secondary school. Similarly in Tunisia.
بليز أخي هديتك مساعدة بليز أخي حبيبي بليز حبيبي.
Popular initiative financed modern Quranic primary schools, providing places for 35,000 children, equivalent to 1 out of 4 going to primary school. In Morocco, the Muslim schools that were established by popular efforts possessed an unusual feature to aim at women's emancipation by having a high percentage of girls, far higher than government schools. The French colonial administration deliberately kept mention of such schools out of their official reports, and they tried to keep their existence hidden from visitors. Another striking example of African self-help with regard to education was the project sponsored by the Graduates General Congress in Sudan. Founded by students, merchants, and civil servants in 1934, the Graduates Congress embarked on a program of school building. Within 4 years, 100 schools were opened with the help of voluntary contributions. A smaller but equally exciting experiment was that to the Bugambu United Schoolboys Association, found by 2 schoolboys in Mwanza, Tanganyika in 1947. It was aimed at adult education and in short time attracted over 1,000 people of all ages. The organizers set up a camp where they housed and fed those who turned up while imparting to them the rudiments of literacy. When Kakua presents or Guy, market women, or Kabali, shepherds, save to build schools and educate their children. That was not entirely in accordance with the objective of the colonialists, who wanted cash crop payments and other money in circulation to return as profits to the metropoles through the purchase of consumer goods. in such small ways. Therefore, Africans were establishing an order of proprietors. Hold on. I have like a piece of hair that won't go away in my face. This intensified in the later years of colonialism, when education came to be seen as having political significance in the era of self-government. Having received higher education in colonial Africa in the post-Second World War era, a French African had reached as far as the French Assembly in Paris, while the English colonial subjects might reach the local legislative assembly as an elected or a nominated member. Those openings were absolutely devoid of power, and there were opportunities that only the merest handful could achieve. But they were stimulants. Nonetheless, giving Africans the notion that considerable vertical mobility would accompany education. In French Equatorial Africa in the late 1940s, it was the African governor, Felix Ibon, who spearheaded the demands for more education for Africans, and he was successful to some extent in forcing the hand of his masters in the French Overseas Ministry. In that same period, and subsequently, it was also African efforts in the legislative councils that kept the question of education to be the fore. The British had handpicked a few educated Africans and some, quote, chiefs, end quote, to advise the governor in the legislative assemblies. Generally, they were decorative, like the plumes of the governor's helmet. But on the issue of education, no African could possibly avoid at least voicing some dissatisfaction with the poor state of affairs. Ultimately, from the pure quantitative viewpoint, Africans pushed the colonialists and the British to grant more education than was allowed for within the colonial system. And that was an important and explosive contradiction that helped Africans regain political independence. It has been observed that British colonies tend to create an educated sector that was larger than that which the colonial economy could absorb. The explanation for that lies in the efforts of African people. Although it is true that the French were more rigorous in rejecting African demands, keeping to their schedule and training only a cadre elite to serve French interest. It was in the colonies such as the Gold Coast, African efforts to achieve education undoubtedly went beyond the numbers required to service the economy. Gold Coast was one of the first colonies to experience the, quote, crisis of primary school leavers, end quote, or the, quote, secondary school bottleneck, end quote. That is to say, among those leaving primary school, many were frustrated because they could not find places in secondary schools, nor could they find jobs in keeping with the values they had obtained in school and in keeping with the internal stratification of African society caused by imperialism. It is sometimes said that Kwame Nkrumah organized the illiterates in the convention's People's Party. That was a charge contemporaneously made by other conservatively educated Ghanaians who thought that Nkrumah was going too far, too fast. In reality, the shock troops of Nkrumah's youth brigade were not illiterate. They had been to primary school and could read the manifestos and the literature of the African nationalist revolution. But they were extremely disaffected because, among other things, they were relative latecomers on the educational scene in Gold Coast. And there was no room in the restricted African establishments of the cocoa monoculture. Colonial powers aimed at giving a certain amount of education to keep colonialism functioning. Africans by various means required more education at the lower level than their allowance, quote unquote. And this was one of the factors which brought about deep crisis and forced the British to consider the idea of withdrawing from colonial apparatus from the Gold Coast. The timetable for independence was also speeding up against the will of the British. As is well known, the regaining of independence in Ghana was not just a local affair, but one that was highly significant for Africa as a whole, and therefore highlights the importance of at least one of the educational contradictions in bringing about political independence in Africa. The Gold Coast colony was not the only one in which there appeared the problems of bottleneck because of the shallowness of the educational pyramid. In the area that was once the Colonial Federation of Rhodesia, and Naziland educators in the 1950s were commenting on primary school lever crisis. They claim to have had a surplus of 6th grade levers, a set of colonies that was educating the insignificant numbers of African school children had a surplus of primary school levers. All it meant was that colonialism was so bankrupt and had so underdeveloped Africa that it had no use for more than a handful of educated. Furthermore, the colonialists had assured every struggling African that if he endured missionary education, he would be given a white-collar job and a passport to civilization. But on leaving school, African youth found the promise to be false. One 6th grade lever on the Central African Federation wrote the following letter to a magazine in 1960. And here's what he wrote. Or they wrote, sorry. After I had passed Standard 6, I spent the whole year at home because I could not get a place anywhere to further my education. At the beginning of this year, I went to look for work, but failed to get it again. From January until now. If I had known that my education would have been useless, I would have told my father not to waste his money in educating me from the beginning of the Standard 6. It would be fairly reasonable to assume that the writer of the latter opposed the white settler Central African Federation. Whether or not he cautiously rationalized the matter, he found he was bound to act as a product of the deep contradictory forces within colonialism, forces which had produced the discrepancies between promise and fulfillment in the terms of his own personal life. Occasionally, the frustrated school leavers might vent their sentiments in non-constructive manner. For instance, the problem of the bottleneck in education and employment arose in Ivory Coast by 1958, and in the context of confused African leadership, the youth of Ivory Coast decided that their enemies was the group of Dahomians and Senegalese who were employed in Ivory Coast. However, on the whole, the situation of frustration aided Africans to perceive more clearly that the enemy was the colonial power, and it therefore added another platform to the movement of regaining African dependency. Africans clashed with colonial structures, not just over quantity of education, but also the quality. One of the key topics for disagreement was colonial agricultural education, to which reference has already been made. The colonialists seemed surprised that the continent of agriculturalists should reject education which was supposedly intended to raise the level of their agriculture. Indeed, some Africans came out against agriculture education and other reforms of Africanized, quote unquote, curricula for what appears to have been selfish elitist reasons. For instance, one Guinean demanded that there should not be a single change from the teaching program as used in the metropolitan France. Quote, we want a metropolitan curriculum and the same diplomas as in France, for we are as French as the French and of the metropoles. End quote. He declared in Tanganyika during the German days, there were also protests against changing the formal and literary educational program as it had been introduced, body and soul, from Europe. A prominent Tanganyikan African, Martin Kayemba, asserted that, quote, those who think that literary education is unsuitable for Africans ignore the fact that of its importance and indispensability to any sort of education, and therefore deny the Africans the very means of progress. What's going on? Hey, Carrot. Holy crap. I didn't see that. We're gonna mute that. Oh my gosh, didn't mute it. Why did I not mute it? All right. Statements such as Statements such as the above have to be seen in their correct context to understand that African response was perfectly justified. The colonialist value system assigned a low value to manual activity and a high value of white-collar bureaucratic works. Even more important, the colonial economy offered manual activity and a high value of white-collar bureaucratic works. Even more important, the colonial economy offered discriminating compensation to those who had literary or, quote, bookish, end quote, education, as opposed to those with manual skills. It was extremely difficult to convince any sane African that education, which would send him to dig the soil and get 100 shillings at the end of the year, was more appropriate than education, which qualified him to work in the civil service for 100 shillings per month. When Europeans preached that brand of wisdom, Africans were suspicious. Hello, everybody. Africans were suspicious about taxes in the colonial era. They never wanted to be counted, nor did they want their chickens to be counted, because bitter experiences had shown them that was how the colonialists assessed taxes. Similarly, on educational issues, there was no confidence in colonial plans to provide different versions of education, because such plans almost invariably meant an even more inferior education, and one that has more blatantly intended to be education for underdevelopment. The most extreme example of colonial education system designed to train Africans to fill their, quote, natural, end quote, role of manual laborers was that in South Africa after the introduction of the Bantu Education Act in 1953. However, the earlier attempts by the British and French to set up what they called farm schools or initiation schools were along the same lines as having since been ruthlessly pursued by the racists in South Africa. The non-literary education had the superficial appearance of being more relevant to Africa, but it was really inferior education for a people who were supposedly inferior in order to make them accept their own exploitation and oppression. As Adubio Mamuyinai, put it, quote, colonial education was cut-rate education, end quote. It offered by European standards low-quality substitutes to suit what was described as a limited intellectual capacity of Africans. In French colonial Africa, the diplomas were seldom equal to those in the metropoles at comparable levels. And in the British East Africa, one official asked educators to bear in mind the gap between themselves and the, quote, grubby S-words, end quote, who Britain was attempting to civilize. Ew. It is in this context that agriculture education, in particular, revealed itself as an exercise of deception. Consequently, the struggle against agriculture or rural schools was one of the most bitter struggles waged by African nationalists. It helped heighten consciousness at all levels of African society with regards to the fundamentally exploitative and racist nature of colonialism. In French West Africa, for example, the farm schools were determinedly opposed after the last war, and the French colonial government had to abolish them. In Tanganyika, the confrontation between the colonialists and the African people was much bigger, because opposition to agriculture education was associated with opposition to colonial agricultural innovations, such as terracing. There were forced upon they associated with opposition to colonial agricultural innovations, such as terracing. There were forced upon which were forced upon people without consultation and without taking into account varying conditions in different localities. In East Africa, the British made a few determined efforts to introduce what they considered a relevant agriculture education. One pilot scheme was the Nyakoto, what they considered a relevant agriculture education. One pilot scheme was the Nyakoto in Tanganyika, which involved transforming a secondary school into an agricultural school in 1930. It lasted for 9 years, with tutors recruiting from Britain and South Africa, but in the end, its attempt failed because the protests by students and the population of the region. Although the schools claimed to be offering new agricultural skills, it was readily recognized that it was a part of a program to find the, quote, correct attitudes, end quote, and, quote, natural place, end quote, which Europeans thought fit for the natives. In the 1940s, as Africans sought to change features of educational systems, they naturally had to demand a voice in councils that formulated educational policies. That was in itself a revolutionary demand, because colonial people are supposed to be ruled, not to participate in decision making. Besides, on one issue of educational policy making, Africans not only alarmed the administrators, but they tirade on the corn of the missionaries, who generally felt that they inherited education at the partition of Africa. All of those clashes were pointing in the direction of freedom for colonial peoples, because in the background there was always a question of political power. It would be erroneous to suggest that educated Africans foresightedly moved into with the intentions of regaining African independence, there would have been very few indeed who, as early as 1939, would have joined Chief Asin in Calabar in asserting, quote, "Without education, it will be impossible for us to get our destination, to get to our destination, which is Nigerians' economic independence and Nigeria's political independence." However, education, both formally and informally, was a powerful force, which transformed the situation into post-war Africa in which a way as to bring political independence to most of colonized Africa within 2 decades. There was also a few Europeans who foresaw that what were called the, quote, dangers, end quote, of giving Africans a modern education, namely the possibility of its leading towards freedom. Certainly, Europeans were not at all happy with any school which were of a European type, but which were not under direct colonialist control. For example, the independent school of Kenya was disliked by white settlers in that colony and by other Europeans outside of Kenya. One Catholic mission report from nearby Tanganyika in 1933 warned against allowing Tanganyikan Africans to set up schools controlled by themselves. It noted, quote, "Independent schools are causing difficulties in Kenya. Such as schools may easily become hotbeds of sedition," end quote. When the Mau Mau War for land and liberation broke out in Kenya, one of the first things a British government did was to close the 149 schools and Kakuya independent schools independent school associations, 21 schools of the Kakuya Karenga Education Association, and 14 other independent schools. They were considered, quote, training grounds for rebellion, end quote, a term which essentially captures the fear expressed in the Catholic schools. They were considered, quote, training grounds for rebellion, end quote, a term which essentially captures the fear expressed in the Catholic mission report just cited. Europeans knew well enough that if they did not control the minds of Africans, they would soon cease to control the people physically and politically. Similarly, in North Africa, the French colonial power and the white colons, C-O-L-O-N-S, or settlers, did not take kindly to self-help schools of the colonized Algerians and Tunisians. The purpose of the schools set up by the Society of Reformists, Umola, and Algeria was that they should be modern and scientific, but at the same time present learning in the context of Arab and African culture. Pupils of the Alimia African culture. Pupils of the Alimia schools were beginning their lessons by singing together, quote, "Arabic is my language, Algeria is my country, Islam is my religion," end quote. And it was no wonder, therefore, that the colonialists victimized pupils and parents and took repressive measures on the grounds of those schools were also hotbeds of sedition. The missionaries asked for control of the schools because that was one of their drawing cards for the church itself, and because they considered themselves experts on the side of cultural imperialism, which they called, quote unquote, civilizing the church itself, and because they considered themselves experts on the side of cultural imperialism, which they called, quote unquote, civilizing. However, there were other Europeans, both within and without the colonies, who were absolutely opposed to schools, be they Christian, independent, government, or Islamic, starting from a racist position. They asserted that offering education to Africans was like throwing pearls before swine. Some of the most violent expressions of racism were directed against educating Africans, starting from a time of individuals like Lord Lungard, and through the days and to the days of the last colonial administrators, like Sir Alan Burns. Many colonialists demonstrated hostilities to educating Africans. Educated Africans made colonialists extremely uneasy because they did not conform to the image of Europeans, like to harbor of the quote unspoiled African S-words, end quote. But if one goes to the heart of the matter, it can be discerned that the white races did not seriously believe that Africans could not master knowledge then in the possession of Europeans. On the contrary, the evidence of educated Africans was before their eyes, and the white settlers especially feared that, given the opportunity, far too many Africans would master white bourgeoisie knowledge too thoroughly. Such Africans would therefore refuse to work as agricultural laborers for 12 shillings per month. They would compete with Europeans in semi-skilled categories, and above all, they would want to govern themselves. In the records of colonialism, it is not uncommon to encounter the following type of remarks, quote, what need is there to educate the natives? Who will give them the weapons to destroy you? End quote. In one sense, those Europeans were simply dreamers because giving education to Africans was not an option which could have been avoided. It was an objective necessity to keep colonialism functioning. P.E. Mitchell, who later became governor of Uganda, remarked in 1928 that, quote, regret it as he may, no director of education can resist the demands of clerks, carpenters, shoemakers, and so on, trained in European methods to meet European needs. These men are not being trained to fit into any place in life of their own people, but to meet the economic needs of the foreign race, end quote. At the same time, the available education was also a consequence of the irrepressible actions of the irrepressible actions of African people who hoped to move forward within the alien system. So those Europeans who were absolutely opposed to giving education to Africans did not understand the contradictions of their own colonial society. But in another sense, they were defending the interests of colonialism. Firstly, however, much of the colonialists tried, they could not succeed in shaping the minds of all Africans whom they educated in schools. The exceptions were the ones who were going to prove most dangerous to colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. And secondly, the most timid and the most brainwashed of educating Africans harbored some form of disagreement with the colonialists, and in the pursuit of their own group of individual interests, the educated elite helped to expose and the African educated as a whole, and those which arose between the colonizer and particular individuals among African educated. As already noted, insufficient educational facilities and inadequate jobs were the complaints raised by the lower echelons of those who were educated in Africa during the colonial period. Those who went on to secondary schools or institutions of higher learning found little access to remunerative and responsible posts because they were destined to fill the lower ranks of the civil and business administrations. After working for 20 years, an African in a civil service would have been extremely lucky to have become, quote, head clerk, or in the police to have become a sergeant. Meanwhile, to add insult to injury, any European doing the same job as an African got higher pay, and whites who were less qualified and experienced were placed above Africans who did the job their superiors were paid to do. In the colonial civil service In the colonial service civil service to be a European was enough. It did not matter whether the white person was arrogant and not intelligent. He would be assured to drawing a fat salary and enjoying a wide privileges. The Guinea-Bissau leader Amilcar Cabral given an example of that type. And here's what Amilcar Cabral says. I was an Aragon, I can't say it. I can't say the word. I know the word, I just can't say it. So I'm going to go to my trusty little thing here. As soon as it, there we go. Aeronongum, I can't say it. All right, come on. There we go. There it is. I get to hear it, hopefully. Agronomist, which is an expert in the science of soil management and crop production. So I was an I gotta hear it again. Sorry, everybody. I was an agronomist working under a European who everybody knew was one of the biggest unintelligent in Guinea. I could have taught him his job with my eyes shut, but he was the boss. This is something which counts a lot. This is the confrontation which really matters. Questions such as salaries, promotion, leaves, and allowances were ones which were the paramount interests of most African civil servant associations and welfare or, quote, improvement, end quote, associations. There should be no illusion concerning the factor of self-interest, but their complaints were justified in terms of the discrepancies between their living standards and those of white expatriates or settlers, as well as in terms of the ideology of the very bourgeoisie who had colonized Africa. The educational process had equipped a few Africans with a grasp of the international community and of bourgeoisie democracy, and there was the most unsatisfactory credibility gap between the ideals of bourgeois democracy and the existence of colonialism as a system which negated freedom. Inevitably, the educated started gravitating in the direction of claims for national independency. Just as educated, I don't know, I'm going to say indigenous, but this could be people from India, but I'm just in case. As educated indigenous had done much earlier on the indigenous subcontinent. I think it's people from India, everybody. According to the official Spanish sources, it is said that the school system in Spanish Guinea achieved all that the colonizers expected of it. It produced the acquired Africans who loved Spaniards more than the Spaniards loved themselves, but it produced no opponents of the colonial regime. It is difficult to believe the truth of such an assertion. The Spanish took good care that no one from outside got wind of what things were like in the small Spanish colonies in Africa. However, if it were true that the colonial education system in Spanish Guinea created only whitewashed Africans according to plan, then what would represent an outstanding exception to the general rule? Wherever adequate evidence is available, it shows that the cultural imperialism of colonial education was successful in large measures, but was never entirely successful. It produced, according to plan, many loyal Kakuya, end quote, or quote, Copernicanists, end quote, or Anna Anglophiles, or Francophiles. Oh, okay. All right. Anglophiles or Francophiles. But it also produced, in spite of itself, those Africans whom the colonialists called upstarts, malcontents, agitators, communists, and terrorists. Jesus Christ. From the viewpoint of the colonialists, trouble often started with African students before they had completed studies. The Sudan, for example, was a history of nationalist students protesting, and Madagascar was outstanding in that respect. From the earlier years of this century, the politicized students movement was growing in Madagascar in spite of the specific steps taken by two French governors. By 1816, Madagascar students had organized the Vato Society, seeking to kick out the French. When the Vato was discovered, students were brutally suppressed. However, as so often happens, students gained aspiration from the martyrdom of their fellows, and they resurfaced at the later date on the nationalist scene. Students who were taken to universities in the metropoles were the most favored and the most pampered of the Africans, selected by white colonial overlords to become Europeanized. And yet, they were among the first to argue vocally and logically that the liberty, equality, and fraternity about which they were taught should apply to Africa. African students in France in the post-war years were placed carefully within the ranks of the then conservative French national student body. But they soon rebelled and formed a Federation of Students of Black Africans, FEANF, which became affiliated with the Communist International Union of Students. In Britain, African students formed a variety of ethnic and nationalist organizations and participated in the Pan-African movement. After all, most of them were sent to study in British constitutions and constitutional law. And for what it is worth, the word quote unquote freedom appeared in those contexts rather often. The fascists who ruled Africans at some points during the colonial epoch tried to avoid bourgeoisie democratic ideas altogether. For example, while the Italian fascists were in charge of Somalia between 1922 and 1941, they took away from history textbooks all reference of Mazina and Garbada, I don't know, two key leaders of the democratic wing of the Italian nationalist movement of the 19th century. Yet the clerks of the NCOs who received that education nevertheless went into the Somali Youth League and fought for independence. The head of popular forces. The fact of the matter is that it was not really necessary to get the ideal of freedom from European books. What the educated Africans extracted from European schooling was a particular formulation of the concepts of political freedom. But it did not take much to elicit a response for their own instructive tendencies for freedom. And as has just been noted in Somalia instance, that universal tendency to seek freedom manifested itself among Africans even when the most careful steps were taken to extinguish it. There was no sector of colonial life in which educated Africans appeared to remain wholly loyal to the colonialists. Teachers were supposed to have been steeped in culture of domination so as to pass it on to other Africans. But in the end, many of them stood as a vanguard of a national independence movement. African priests and pastors were supposed to have been loyal servants of God and his European lieutenants, but the church gave birth to Nyasaland, to John Chilabamwe as early as the First World War. Shortly afterwards in Congo, when Simon Kambangu started his independent church, he actually threatened the colonialists that he would introduce Bolshevism. Interesting. Nice. It is particularly interesting to notice that the colonialists could not be sure of the loyalty of their African troops. It has already been argued that the army and police were educational and socializing institutions to perpetuate colonialist and capitalist powers and values. How successful they served that function can be seen in the number of veterans in Burma and Indochina who returned to the continent to carry out loyally and policies of Britain and France, respectively. Colonel Bokassa in the Central African Republic and Colonel Lambezina in the Upper Volta provided two outstanding examples, both of them having graduated from fighting in Vietnam, fighting the Vietnamese, to the point where they are preparing to dialogue with the fascist apartheid state in South Africa. However, return soldiers also played a very positive role in national independence struggles after both wars. And, hold on. Come on. There we go. And occasionally, towards the end of colonial rule, African troops and police mutinied as a Nyasaland in 1959. African trade unionists also went to quote-unquote school under colonialism. To begin with, the organization and activities of the small wage earning sectors in Africa bothered the colonialists a great deal. Their initial desire was to crush working dissent, and when that appeared unlikely to succeed, it co-opted it and guided it along, quote, acceptable channels. The British Trade Unions Council sponsored a number of African trade unions and tried to get them to accept a rigid separation between industrial matters, such as wages and working hours, and political matters. But the TUC was that context acting on behalf of the British bourgeoisie, and they did not succeed in holding back the working class in Africa. African workers were able to appreciate that there was no difference between the private employers and the colonial administration. Indeed, the colonial administration was itself one of the biggest employers against whom workers had many charges. Consequently, in the 1940s and 1950s, it was common to have strikes that were specifically connected with the struggling of independence, notably in the Gold Coast, Nigeria, and Sudan. The contradictions between French workers and African workers in French colonies emerged in a very acute form. The French trade unions movement, and notably the Communist Union, the CGT, insisted that Africans should not have separate unions, but should have members of French labor unions just like other French workers. The arrangement gave support to the judicial political functions in places like Dahomey and Camarori Islands were not colonies, but merely the overseas sections of France. Sékou Touré in Guinea was one of the first to break with the patrons of French trade unions and to establish an independent African trade union. In so doing, Sékou Touré made it clear that the principal contradictions of the colonial situation was that between colonized people on the one hand, and the colonizing nations on the other. So long as African workers remained colonized, they had to think of themselves firstly as African workers rather than members of an international proletariat. The interpretation was, which was entirely in accordance with reality, led to a trade union movement taking on highly politicized and nationalist role in French West Africa. It was an achievement which defeated the chauvinism of white French workers, as well as the class interests of the French bourgeoisie. The attitude of the white metropolitan working class towards the African counterparts was influenced by the prevailing racist values of capitalist societies. Indeed, the racist factor heightened the principal contradictions between the colonized and the colonized, colonizers and the colonized. Discriminatory racist methods and measures were found in every colony, with varying degrees of openness of hypocrisy. Sometimes white racism was vicious, and at other times it was paternalist. Nor did it necessarily reflect European desires to exploit Africans economically. In southern Rhodesia, racial discrimination was very much tied up with the white settlerism maintaining their jobs and the stolen land. But when some semi-literate white inspectors insulted an educated Sierra Leonean, that many were referred to as gratuitous. Racism in such a context actually jeopardizes economic exploitation, and it was merely a manifestation of prejudice that had grown over the centuries. I'm gonna look ahead real quick. So we're at that mark. 1, 2, 3, 4. Wow, we're almost done with this. The racial contradictions extended far beyond the shores of Africa because of the historical antecedents of the slave trade. It is not in the least surprising that Pan-African ideas should have been most forcefully expressed by West Indians like Garvey or Padmore, or North Americans like W.E.B. Du Bois and Alphonsus Hunton. Those individuals had all been educated within the international capitalist structure of exploitation on the basis of class and race, having realized that their inferior status in the societies of America was conditioned by the fact that being black and the weakness of Africa, and Pan-Africanists were forced to deal with the central problems of Europe's exploitation and oppression of the African continent. Needless to say, the metropolitan powers could never have foreseen that their humiliation of millions of Africans in the New World would ultimately rebound and help Africa to emancipate itself. The process of which Africa produced 30-odd sovereign states was an extremely complex one, characterized by an interplay of forces and calculation on the part of various groups of Africans, on the part of the colonial powers, and on the part of interest groups inside the metropoles. African independence was affected by international events such as the Second World War and the rise of the Soviet Union, the independence of India and China, the People's Liberation Movement in Indochina, and the Bandung Conference. The Bandung Conference, yeah. On the African continent itself, the domino theory, quote unquote, operated so that the reemergence of Egypt and Nigeria, the earlier independence of Ghana, Sudan, and Guinea, the nationalist war in Kenya, the Algerian, all helped to knock down the colonies which remained standing. However, it must be stressed that the move for the regaining of independence was initiated by the African people, and to whatever extent that objective was realized, the motor force of the people must be taken into account. In the conference held by the French in Brazzaville in 1948 and chaired by General de Gaulle, it was explicitly stated that, quote, the establishment, even in a distant future, of self-government in the colonies is to be avoided, end quote. As is well known in French, eventually considered the ideal of conceding independence to African people after being taught a sultry lesson by the Algerian people. Moreover, when Guinea chose independence in 1958, rather than accept being permanently a footstool for France, the French administrators literally went ridiculous and behaved like wild pigs before sailing from Guinea. They just could not cope with the ideal of African independence. Apart from the Portuguese, the Belgians were the colonialists who were the most reluctant in withdrawing in the face of African nationalism. In 1953, the Belgian professor suggested independence for the Congo in 30 years, and he was regarded as a radical. Of course, Congo turned out to be one of the places where imperialism was successful in hijacking the African Revolution. But the order of events must still be considered. Firstly, it was intensity of the Congolese and the African demand that made independence thinkable as far as the Belgians were concerned. And secondly, it was precisely the strength of the potential of the nationalist movements under the Lumumba which forced the imperialists to resort to murder and invasion. The British make much of the fact that they conceded the idea of self-government immediately after the last war, but self-government was a long cry from independence, and the notion of training people for independence was nothing but a political gimmick. Lady Marguerite Perham, a true voice of patronizing colonialism, admitted that the colonial office timetable for independence had to be scrapped in the face of mobilized African people. For that matter, even African leaders never hoped to achieve national sovereignty as rapidly as they did until the mass parties began to roll like boulders down the hillside. Sacrifice of life and limb. In brief, it is enough to say that African people as a collective had upset the plans of the colonialists and had surged forward to freedom. Such a position may seem to be a mere revival of a certain rosy and romantic view of African independence which was popular in the early 1960s. But on the contrary, it is fully cognizant of the shabby reality of neo-colonial Africa. It needs to be affirmed from revolutionary socialist and people-centered perspective that even, quote, flag independence, end quote, represented a positive development out of colonialism. Securing the attributes of sovereignty is but one stage in the process of regaining African independence. By 1985, when Africa was politically and judicially partitioned the peoples and policies, people and polities had already lost a great deal of freedom in its relations with the external world. Africa had lost a considerable amount of control over its own economy ever since the 15th century. However, the loss of political sovereignty at the time of the scramble was decisive. By the same reasoning, it is clear that the regaining of political sovereignty by the 1960s constituted an inescapable first step in regaining maximum freedom to choose and to develop in all spheres. Furthermore, the period of nationalist revolution gave rise to certain minority ideological trends which represent the roots of failure African development. Most African leaders of the intelligentsia and even the labor movement were frankly capitalists and shared fully the ideology of their bourgeoisie masters. Hamfouti Bonnier was at one time called a quote-unquote communist by the French colonizers. He defended himself vigorously against the false charges in 1948. And here's what he said. "We have good relations with the French Communist Party. That is true. But it is obvious that that does not mean that we ourselves are communists. Can it be said that I, Hamfouti Bonnier, can't say his name right, a traditional chief, a doctor of medicine, a big property owner, a Catholic, can it be said that I am a communist?" Bonnier's reasoning applied to so many more African leaders of the independence epoch. The exceptions were those who either completely rejected the worldview of capitalism, or at least stuck honestly to those idealistic tenets of bourgeoisie ideology, such as individual freedom, and through experience, they could come to realize that the ideas remain myths in a society based on exploitation of man by man. Clearly, all leaders of the nonconformist type had developed a direct contradiction to the aim of formal and informal colonial education, and their differences with the colonizers were too profound to have been resolved merely by, quote, flag independence, end quote. African independence was greeted with prompt ceremony and a resurgence of traditional African music and dance. Quote, "A new day has dawned," end quote. And then another quote, "We are on the threshold of a new era," end quote. And another quote, "We have now entered into a political kingdom," end quote. Those were phrases of the day, and they are repeated until they become cliches. But all the toing and froing from Cotonou to Paris, and from London to Lusuka, and all the lowering and raising of flags cannot be said to have been devoid of meaning. Withdrawing of a directly controlled military judicial apparatus of the colonizers was essentially before any new alternatives could be posed with regard to political organization, social structures, and economic development. The above issues were raised most seriously by the minority of African leaders who had individually embarked on the non-capitalist path of development of their own mode of thought. And the problems were considered within the context of inequalities and contradictions, not just between Africa and Europe, but also inside Africa, as a reflection of 4 centuries of slavery and 1 century of colonialism. As for as far as the masses of peasants and workers were concerned, the removal of overt foreign ruler actually cleared the way towards a more fundamental appreciation of exploitation and imperialism. Even the territories such as Cameroon, where the imperialists brutally crushed peasants and workers and installed their own tried and tested puppets. Advance had been made insofar as the masses has already participated in trying to determine their own destiny. That is, the element of conscious activity that signifies the ability to make history by grappling with the heritage of objective material and conditions of social relations. That's the end of that chapter. Let's see here. I got 15 more minutes. I'm going to read this chapter. This is the postscript. So I'll read the postscript and that should be it. And that should be the last of the book. Because after the postscript, it is just guided further reading. All right. Postscript by A.M. Babu. B-A-B-U. There are shortcuts to economic development for the underdevelopment economies. Are there shortcuts for economic development for underdevelopment economics? This question has occupied the attention of many interested parties during the last decade. These include university lecturers, international economists, and United Nations and its agency, the OAU, planning agencies and economic ministers. Many international conferences under various sponsorship have been held during the decade of volumes of resolutions, guidelines, learning documents, and these have been published. The end result has been negative. The developing countries continue to remain underdeveloped, only getting worse in relations to developed countries. By and large, the question still remains unanswered. Are we going to repeat the same exercises all over again during the decade? It appears that we are. Already the UN has launched the second economic decade with the same zeal and fanfare as they did with the first. The same appeal has gone out to the developed countries to the charitable and contribute, quote, 1% of their national income, end quote, for helping the developing countries, as if the population of the world can continue to condone poverty as so that the rich can be charitable. If past experience is anything to go by, the 70s will experience the same disappointments which climaxed the end of the 60s. What we must ask has gone wrong. It is something inherited in the very nature of underdevelopment that makes development such an impossible task. Among many prescriptions that have been offered, i.e., IG, cultural, social, and psychological, even economic, none has produced any encouraging results. In fact, nearly all of them have had negative results and made bad situations worse. We are to continue with the same experiments at the expense of the people who, let's face it, have borne the whole burden of these experiments throughout the last decade. This is a question to which all the developing countries, especially those in Africa, must address themselves. And the sooner the better, because there is very little time before our economies become permanently distorted and probably too damaged for the meaningful reconstruction in the future. Dr. Walter Rodney, in his very instructive book, provides a very fresh opening for discussion, which may well lead to finding the right solution. He raises the most basic and fundamental questions regarding the nature of underdevelopment and economic backwardness. Unlike many works of this nature, which to all intents and purposes, have approached the problem with sort of metaphysical outlook. Garbed, it is true in scientific terminology. Dr. Rodney follows the methods of historical materialism, which in effect says, quote, to know the present, we must look into the past, and to know the future, we must look into the past and the present, end quote. This is a scientific approach. We can at least be sure that the conclusion will not be marred by subjective distortion. It is clear, especially after reading Rodney's exposition, that throughout the last decade, we have been posing the wrong questions regarding economic backwardness. We did not, quote, look into the past to know the present, end quote. We were told and accepted that our poverty was caused by our poverty in a now famous theory of the, quote, vicious circle of poverty, end quote. And we went around in circles seeking ways and means of breaking that cycle. Had we asked the fundamental question which Dr. Rodney raises in his works, we would not have exposed our economics to the ruthless plunder brought about by foreign investment, quote unquote, which the exponent of the various circle theory urged us to do. For it is clear, foreign investment is the cause and not the solution, and our economic backwardness. Are we not underdeveloped now because we have been colonized in the past? There is no other explanation to the fact that practically the whole of the undeveloped world has been colonized, either directly or indirectly by the Western powers, and that is colonialism. And what is colonialism if it is not a system of, quote, foreign investments, end quote, by the metropolitan powers? If it has contributed to our underdevelopment in the past, it is not likely to contribute to our underdevelopment now. If it has contributed to our underdevelopment in the past, it is not likely to contribute to our underdevelopment now, even if the political reins are in our hands. Put it in this way, the question of underdevelopment is immediately rendered more intelligible, even to the oh my gosh, I don't know this word. All right, I gotta look up this word, everybody. Almost finished. Let's go over just slightly. Oh, God damn it. Uninitiated. And this is how Dr. Rodney is directing us to pose our questions. The inevitable conclusion is that foreign investment does not only help to undermine our economics, but in extracting erroneous profits, but it does not seriously damage to but it does more serious damage to the economies by distorting them into lopsidedness. If the process is not arrested in time, the distortion can be permanent. As long as we continue, as we have done for centuries, to produce for the so-called world market, which was founded on the hard rock of slavery and colonialism, or our economies will remain colonial. Any development will be entirely incidental, leaving the vast majority of the population wholly uninvolved in the economic activities. The more we invest in export branches in order to capture the quote world market, the more we divert away from investing for people's development, and constantly the less effective our development efforts. Since this type of investment does not contribute much towards the development of a material or technical base, internally, our economies are rendered always responsive only to what the Western world is preparing to buy and sell, and hardly responsive to our own internal development needs. That is why, although most of our development plans make elaborate resource allocations for, quote, rural projects, end quote, invariably, most of these resources find their way back to the urban projects, and consequently accentuated the urban-rural disparities, slums and unemployment, social maladjusted, and finally, political instability are our most outstanding characteristics. Almost without exceptions, all the ex-colonial countries have ignored the cardinal development demand, namely, that to be really effective, the development process must begin by transforming the economy from its colonial and externally responsive structure to one which is internally responsive. Internally responsive. Yeah. Where we went wrong is when we allowed blindly the assumption handed down to us by our exploiters. This assumption can be stated briefly as follows. Growth in underdeveloped countries is hampered by inadequate growth in exports and inadequate financial resources, and is made worse by, quote, population explosion, end quote. In these countries, and the solution is prescribed as follows. Step up export, increase aid and loans from developed countries, and arrest growth in population. Throughout the last decade, our efforts have been to follow rigorously the above prescription, and even if our own experience continues to disprove it, we will still adhere to it even more frantically. The greatest need appears to be the process of mental decolonization, since neither common sense nor sound economics, nor even our own experience is with us in this. Experience of other countries have that chosen experiences of other countries that have chosen a different path, a path of economic reconstruction, is most extractive. Here, take North Korea or Albania. Both these countries were underdeveloped as late as the 50s. The reason they have been able to register most outstanding economic progress is that they have decided to opt out of production for the so-called world market and have diverted their resources towards the development of a material and technological base internally. The Parson Commission. Don't worry, everybody. The Parson Commission report, Partners in Development, has been held even by the developing countries as ushering a new era, a sort of turning point, a international corporation for development. Even if its recommendation were to be adopted and the implementation in toto, it is doubtful if it would make any impact on even widening gap between the developed and developing countries. This is because it has avoided tackling the most fundamental questions, namely, quote, can development take place when our production strategy is influenced by the demand of the world market, which is determined almost exclusively by the pattern of production and consumption within the capitalist Europe and America? In other words, the distortion of distorting our economies to fit in with the demands of the world market, the demands of which are not always compatible with the demands of our own development, we are not in the process deriving our economies of the capacity for a self-sustaining growth, which is preconditioned to development. By posing the question in this style, it is possible to see throughout the smokescreen of international do-gooders and begin to understand the real cause of our underdevelopment. It is, of course, too much to expect Pearson, or people of a liberal inclination, to pose the question in this way, since their training and outlook consider this way of putting the question to be almost morally sinful and economically subversive. However, as leaders of developing countries, we are obliged to adopt this style of posing the question, since we have taken upon ourselves the responsibility of steering our development course, a development course whose success or failures will affect, one way or another, the well-being of hundreds of millions of people who comprise more than 2/3 of the human race. For too long have we left their fate to be determined by the kind of production which is not based on the satisfaction of their wants, but rather on serving external interests as expressed by the accepted laws of supply and demand in the so-called world market. We have twisted their education in such a way that the quote-unquote skills we directed them to develop are geared towards serving the same ends of the world market, rather towards the development of the internal material base, with the result that technologically and in relations to the developed world, we move backwards rather than forward. We have tamely accepted the so-called international division of labor on behalf of our masses, and in doing so, we have condemned them to specialize in primary commodities. Those productions is conductive neither to the development of technological skills nor to the inventions of advanced machinery, both of which are the preconditions to a real economic development. The significance of Dr. Rodney's book is that it addresses quite appropriately to the masses and not to the leaders, and one hopes that it will be an instrument to arouse some mass actions by the people. In the absence of committed leadership, many African countries have fallen prey to military exploitation, to the extent that today the generals constitute the majority of the African summit. This is as it should be, because when the political leadership loses the sense of internal direction, when in bewilderment, it gives up its efforts to find solutions to people's problems and begins to accumulate wealth for its own individual use, political leadership tends to get increasingly commandists. In its state operations, logic and rationale become subversive, and when politicians become commandists, they too become redundant, because who is better litted to give command than the army? With very few exceptions, it is sad to have to admit that Africa is ill-served by a current conglomeration of what passes from leaders throughout the continent. When Asia and Latin America produce giants like Mao, Ho Chi Minh, and Che, who inspire and excite the imaginations not only of their compatriots within the borders, but of the rest of the world, including the developing world. Africa was produced only one, Nyerere, and maintained him in power. Sorry, while we have murdered Lubumba and have locked up or exiled leaders like Ben Bala or Nkrumah in response to wishes of the imperialists, our donors, our moneylenders, our patrons, our masters, our trading partners. I got only one more page left. With all due respects, it is difficult to imagine, apart from one or two honorable exceptions, any of the present leaders who is capable of standing up for the genuine rights of his people, knowing that these rights are a necessity directly opposed to the interests of imperialism. And yet, such a stand is necessary if we are to really fulfill the obligations as leaders. Otherwise, we have no right to impose our leadership on the people. While most of the leaders on the continent have no sense of urgency in solving the problems of the people's misery, since they don't bear the brunt of their misery, the masses who do cannot wait. That is why one hopes that Dr. Rodney's book will be read by as many people as possible, because it has come at a time when it is most needed for action. After reading the harrowing accounts of brutalities, of slavery and subjugation, of deprivation and humiliation, when whole civilization were crushed in order to serve the imperialist interests of the West, when settled societies were disintegrated by force of imperialist arms, so that the plantation owners of the quote-unquote New World could get their uprooted and therefore permanent labor force to build what is now the most advanced capitalist economy, and becoming absolutely clear that the only way out of our current impasse is through the revolutionary path, a complete break with the system which is responsible for all our past and present miseries. Our future course must be guided dialectically. If by looking into the past we have known the present, and to know the future we must look into the past and the present. Our action must be related to our concrete experience, and we must not give way to metaphysical hopes and wishes, hoping and wishing that the monsters who have been after us throughout our history will someday change into a lamb. He won't. As Engels puts it, quote, freedom does not consist in the dream of independence from natural law, but the knowledge of these laws. Freedom of the will, therefore, means nothing but the capacity to make decisions with knowledge of the subject, end quote. We know the subject only too well, and he is a monster. Do we have the capacity to make decisions? Now that Dr. Rodney has provided us with the knowledge of the subject, the people must answer. And that's the end. Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, December 1971, A.M. Bambo. The rest is just further guided stuff. All right. That's the end. End of the book. We'll start grounding with my brothers tomorrow. Who's up? Who's in here? Fred Hampton. Interesting. Who is Fred Hampton? Oh, they're not there anymore. All right, sweet. All right. Does anybody have any questions or anything? I'm ill. I can't come up. You're ill? You just got sick all of a sudden? Oh, thanks for staying around, Antiquity. Antiquity. I did it right. Just had to slow it down. Antiquity. There we go. Antiquity. I'm going to do it again. Antiquity. Antiquity. Yay! I just gotta keep saying it. Antiquity. Watch, when I see your name again, I'll do it the other way. Oh no. All right, I'll bring up one more person, and then. What's up?
You said my name 3 times.
Antiquity. Oh my gosh, antiquity. Antiquity. Antiquity.
It's not my real name, clearly. But...
Oh, I know. It's not your real name. It's like communist is not my real name.
Oh, no, I think it is. No, that's my legal
You think it is?
No, I'm kidding.
Hey, you know what? That'd be based if my parents woke up and like, hey, we're gonna name my son communist.
I mean, my real name is close enough to this.
Oh, really?
It starts with an A.
Okay. Well, tomorrow we'll be starting a new book.
That's cool.
Grounding with My Brothers. It's another Walter Rodney book.
What's it about?
Well, I forgot what it's about, but I think it's the Jamaican question, like on Jamaica, like stuff. So I think it's with his experience in Jamaica and how he organized and built organizations and stuff. So we'll see what it's like.
I mean, I like this book because I'm African myself.
Oh, you like this book? Nice.
Yeah, I found it very interesting to hear from all different perspectives because I have like my Southern African. I'm not South African, but like just like the area of South Africa is colonized by the British. So
yeah, the Dutch, all of those.
Yeah, the Dutch and what are they called? The Portuguese as well.
The Portuguese. Yep.
Yeah, because I'm Zimbabwean.
Nice.
And I mean, we have a deep colonial history with the British and partially the Portuguese earlier on.
Yeah. So now people would say that we are in we're in neocolonialism. But one of my friends, one of my comrades would say like he would gather to say that we're still in colonialism. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I mean, Zimbabwe's has had its independence for just over 40 years now.
Yeah, but
there's still so much interest in there from Britain and now China, obviously. Yeah.
Well, it's just like there's still extraction, there's still imperialism.
Yeah, I was not finishing my point. That's what I was going into. But
yeah, they're still extracting and imperializing. You know, until like the revolution of socialism, the answer to imperialism, the answer to capitalism is socialism, is communism. You know what I mean? So like, since the answer comes to fruition, then I think the United States owes reparations to the global South and to the people here in the United States. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
Yeah.
And like my father, he's the one who's Zimbabwean. I'm very mixed overall. Like I'm from different parts of the world. He's made sure I've gone back to Zimbabwe and seen my family and know where I came from and
connect, keep those roots connected and stuff.
Yeah, keep those roots connected because my grandmother, she was from a small tribe, what's like on the border of what's now Zimbabwe and Mozambique.
Oh.
So I got to go back there and meet everyone.
I'm messing up a lot of African names.
It's totally fine. It's not a big deal. I think the act of learning and attempting to understand, and we can't all be perfect with pronunciation of words and groups of people and things like that. It's the act of trying to be better with it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm getting better, I think. I'm pronouncing better. I used to be able to not pronounce Tanganyika.
There you go.
So, getting better. Now, when you hear me try to read Mao Zedong selective works and I try to say some of the Chinese provinces, oh my God. I sound like... You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not going to get any of those right, so...
And I'm reading Lenin selected works. Oh my gosh, some of the names, the Russian names are okay.
Oh yeah.
But a lot of the Russian words are like, how do you do this?
So So if you can tell by my name, Antiquity, I'm interested in like Greek, Roman, Egyptian, stuff like that. I still have trouble saying words in Latin,
Yeah.
even though I can speak the language
I
and I
have a question.
understand. Yeah.
Question. I've been coming across this Sudanese creator who comes on and says,